The village of Zundert, in the southern Netherlands, sat low in the land, its fields parted by narrow footpaths and wind-worn hedgerows. The houses were made of pale brick and timber, their roofs hunched like sleeping animals. Here, on the 30th of March in 1853, a boy was born in a pastor's home just a short walk from the churchyard. They named him Vincent. It was a name that had already been carved once into stone. A year before, another Vincent had been born to the same mother and father. That child had died on the day of his birth, wrapped in silence and sorrow. The family had buried him beneath a simple grave marker that bore just the name. No dates, no epitaph. And now, precisely 1 year later to the day, a second son arrived, alive, breathing, but born into the shadow of the first. The grave stood just a few paces from the church door. Vincent would pass it often as he grew. He would read his name on the cold slab of stone, etched clearly in the old style. Vincent van Gogh. His birthday marked above the earth, and beneath it too. In time, he would come to feel that his life had been borrowed, or perhaps mistakenly kept. The house he grew up in was simple but full. There were 6 children in all: Anna, Theo, Lise, Wilhelmine, and Cor. His father, Theodorus, was the village pastor. A tall man with a gentle voice and deep-set eyes, he filled their days with sermons, verses, and a quiet but unwavering expectation of godliness. Their mother, Anna, was orderly and exacting, a lover of flowers and housework, who sketched now and then in the quiet hours of the afternoon. Vincent did not shine among his siblings. He was solemn, awkward, often lost in thought. He did not speak much at mealtimes. He would forget chores and wander out alone for hours, returning with wet shoes and a pocket full of pebbles or dry seed pods. The other children played games in the lane or raced through the orchard. Vincent sat under trees and watched the sky instead. From the beginning, he felt a closeness to the natural world that had nothing to do with science or sport. He watched leaves curl under frost and studied the heavy drift of clouds across the low horizon. Once, he stood so long in the rain behind the house that his mother thought he was ill, but he only said quietly, "It smells like iron and water." I wanted to listen. He began drawing early, not with flair or flourish. His lines were thick and often heavy-handed, but they had a stillness to them, a small truth. He would sketch tree trunks, birds, the tilted roofs of Zundert's cottages. He used the margins of his father's sermon papers or bits of wrapping from the kitchen. One day, he gave Theo a sketch of a beetle crawling across a blade of grass. It was clumsy but careful, its legs too many, its body bent just so. Theo kept the drawing for years. Their bond was strong from the beginning. Theo was gentler, sweeter in temperament, and often found himself looking after Vincent in small ways. When Vincent grew quiet, Theo would sit beside him. When he became upset, which he did more often as he got older, Theo would find something simple to distract him. A walk, a book, a game of marbles. Of all the people in Vincent's life, only Theo seemed to understand how far inward his mind could drift, and how fragile the path back could be. The house, for all its warmth, was filled with expectation. Their father demanded uprightness, control, a steady heart. Their mother insisted on propriety, cleanliness, calm. Vincent struggled under these things. He was prone to moods, bursts of laughter followed by silence, then a kind of restless energy that had nowhere to go. His father tried to reason with him. His mother tried to discipline him, but neither could quiet the storm inside him. He attended the village school for a time, then was sent away to a boarding school in Zevenbergen when he was 11. The train ride there was long and full of fog. Vincent stared out the window the whole way, watching fields pass like waves. The school was strict and gray. He did not enjoy it. He missed the slow lanes of Zundert, the fields, and the way the trees leaned near his bedroom window when the wind was high. He wrote letters home, not always cheerful, but full of detail. The kind of detail one notices when they are lonely. He described the color of the curtains in his room, the sound of snow falling on the slate roof, the way the teacher pronounced Latin words with a cough in his throat. He drew, too, in the margins of notebooks, on scrap paper, on the backs of letters, and always, he kept walking, along ditches, beside canals, beneath trees that reminded him of home. By the age of 13, Vincent had begun to change. He grew taller, more angular, his features sharpening into the long lines of the man he would become. His eyes held something unreadable, not cold, but distant. Teachers found him difficult to place. He was not gifted in mathematics, and his Dutch essays were erratic, but he wrote with feeling. There were glimmers in him of something else, something that didn't quite fit into a schoolroom. After Zevenbergen, he was sent to a secondary school in Tilburg. The building was large and serious, and the lessons even more so. He lasted only a year. It wasn't failure that sent him home, not officially. But Vincent's spirit had dimmed there. His letters grew brief and flat. He stopped drawing altogether for several weeks, which was unusual. And when his parents asked if he was homesick, he said only that his thoughts made too much noise in a room that large. He returned to Zundert, quieter than before. His mother had filled the garden with late summer flowers. Vincent helped her weed the edges, not saying much. She noticed the way he watched the clouds pass overhead more than he looked at her. In the evenings, he sat in the parlor reading scripture, but his mind wandered often. Theo was now away at school himself, and Vincent missed him deeply. They wrote to each other with surprising warmth, even then. The letters between them would one day number in the hundreds, stretching across decades, filled with affection, encouragement, and the ache of two brothers who understood each other in ways no one else quite could. It was around this time that Vincent took more frequent walks beyond the village, sometimes as far as Eton or the edge of the heath. He carried a notebook with him, sketching farmhouses and fences, birds in the stubbled fields, the tilted lean of willow trees after the wind. He never stayed out too long, but always long enough to come home tired and quiet, soothed in some way no one could quite name. His parents began to worry. He was old enough, they thought, to begin preparing for real work. His uncle Sent, a successful art dealer, offered him an opportunity, a position at Goupil & C, an art dealership with offices in The Hague. It was a respectable job, not an artist, of course. That idea was too vague, too unstable. But a clerk, yes. Someone who worked among paintings, who understood their value, who could learn to sell beauty to others. Vincent agreed with little protest. He did not speak of ambition. He did not ask for advice. He simply packed a trunk with a few shirts, a Bible, a small sheaf of his drawings, and one gray coat that buttoned to the neck. The night before he left, Theo visited from school. The two brothers walked out past the church along the edge of the fields. The sky was deep with stars, and the grass carried the scent of rain from earlier in the day. Vincent stopped to look back toward the house. "If I had stayed," he said, "I wonder if I would have turned into one of the trees." Theo didn't answer. He only looked up at the stars and kept walking. Voice insert 2. One may have a blazing hearth in one's soul, and yet no one ever comes to sit by it. Vincent. The train to The Hague left early. Vincent sat by the window, staring out at the low land passing by, flat and green and hushed by morning mist. He clutched his sketchbook in one hand, though he didn't open it. His mind felt full. Not with hope exactly, but with a sense that something had started moving. Something quiet and hard to name. In The Hague, The air was thicker, tinged with smoke and the scent of coal. The streets were louder, the buildings taller, stacked with windows and busy with carriages. Goupil and Cie occupied a wide storefront, its windows filled with prints and paintings in heavy frames. Vincent stood before it a long time before going in. He stared at a copy of a Rembrandt sketch in the window, a face half in shadow, the lines worn like bark. Inside, the floors creaked under soft rugs. The rooms smelled of varnish and paper. He was assigned small tasks at first, organizing catalogs, writing invoices, preparing shipments. He was quiet, but diligent. He asked many questions. His supervisors noted his seriousness. They did not yet know how much of his heart was already being given away to the pictures he wrapped. After hours, he walked the city's edge, where canals opened to meadows. He drew there. He bought a small case of graphite pencils and kept them with him always. Slowly, a rhythm formed. Work by day, drawing by dusk, letters to Theo on Sundays. And though his days were no longer shaped by the slow skies of Zundert, Vincent carried them with him still. In the line of a roof, the angle of a street, the tired bend of a working man's back. He watched everything. He saw with the eyes of someone who had lived alone among fields and shadows. Vincent was 19 when he began to feel the pull of something deeper. He could not yet name it, but it moved in him like weather. The work at Goupil and Cie was steady, respectable, yet he felt a distance growing between himself and the others in the shop. They discussed sales and clients, styles, and prices. Vincent, meanwhile, found himself staring at the sorrow in a mother's eyes in a millet print, or the soft sag of a man's shoulders in a Daumier drawing. He wanted to understand what made an image true, not what made it valuable. After 2 years in The Hague, he was transferred to the London branch. It was a promotion, a chance to prove himself. Vincent crossed the channel alone, his belongings tucked in a small trunk and his sketchbook pressed tight between his clothes. London in the 1870s was a city of gas lamps and fog, horse-drawn carriages and crowded streets. Vincent found lodging in Brixton, with a schoolmistress and her daughter. He walked to the gallery each day, sometimes stopping to sketch the lamplighters in the early morning haze. He tried to be friendly. He read Dickens. He wrote long letters home, full of odd little details. The shape of the chimneys, the sound of church bells, the color of puddles after rain. For a time, he seemed almost content. But it was here, in this new city, that Vincent experienced his first deep heartbreak. He had fallen in love quietly, without warning. The schoolmistress's daughter, kind, curious, always humming softly when she washed dishes, had become, in his letters, a symbol of something tender and good. He told her how he felt. She did not return the feeling. The rejection was gentle, but to Vincent it echoed like thunder. He did not know how to let go. His letters to Theo became longer, more desperate, filled with questions about love and loneliness. He began to speak more openly of faith, of duty, of suffering. The pain didn't leave him. It deepened into something else. He began to withdraw. His work at the gallery suffered. He lost interest in sales. He began reading the Bible obsessively, quoting it in his letters, visiting poor neighborhoods to give away tracts and advice. His employers were confused. He had once shown promise. Now, he was distracted, intense, often argumentative. Within a year, he was let go. Vincent left London with little ceremony. He carried the same trunk, though it felt heavier now. He returned to the Netherlands for a time, but he couldn't settle. He wandered between cities, between plans, always restless, always searching for something to give his life a shape. It was during this drifting period that he decided to become a preacher. He enrolled in theology courses in Amsterdam, hoping to follow his father's path. But the studies were difficult. His mind, while passionate, was undisciplined. He argued with professors, questioned doctrine, focused more on the poor outside the churches than the rules within them. He left before completing his exams. Yet his desire to serve never faded. He applied to be a missionary and was sent to the Borinage, a bleak mining region in southern Belgium. It was a place of soot and silence. The miners lived hard lives, carved into the earth. Many slept in shared rooms, their faces blackened from coal, their eyes slow to meet strangers. Vincent moved into a small hut. He gave away most of his possessions, even his bed, sleeping on the floor beside the poorest men. He tended to the sick, read scripture by candlelight, offered his small comforts wherever he could. But the church authorities found his behavior too extreme. They dismissed him. Again, Vincent was without a place, without work, without clear direction. He didn't return home. Instead, he wandered the paths of the Borinage, sketchbook in hand. He drew the miners, bent and weary, hands wrapped in cloth, eyes lost in the dust. Something inside him had changed. He was still a man of faith, but now he began to believe that images could carry a kind of grace too, that drawing the poor might be its own kind of prayer. Voice insert 3. I want to touch people with my art. I want them to say. He felt deeply. He felt tenderly. Vincent. The quiet of the coal country suited him. The harsh light, the blackness of stone, the narrow mouths of the tunnels. It was not beauty in the traditional sense, but it was real, and realness mattered more. He wrote to Theo of a new resolve. He would become an artist, not a painter of prettiness or of fashion, but a witness, a mirror, a voice for those the world passed over. I feel, he wrote, that my future lies there. He was 27 years old. Vincent returned to his parents' home in Eton in the early spring, worn thin, but oddly certain. His clothes were patched. His eyes had darkened with thought. He spoke more slowly than before, but when he spoke of art, his voice took on a strange brightness. His parents, especially his father, were relieved to have him home, but they were not sure what to make of this new direction. He no longer dressed like a pastor in training. He spent long hours walking the fields alone, sketchbook in hand. He would pause for half an hour beneath a tree or beside a ditch, sometimes only to draw the curve of a fence post or the bent figure of a farmer sowing seed. His lines were still rough, but something in them had changed. A kind of urgency had begun to show, a hunger for truth, even if it came out crooked. He converted a corner of the parsonage into a studio. A table, a chair, a few sheets of paper, and a box of pencils. No more than that. He drew peasants, laborers, the women of the village bent over their work. He was not looking for beauty in the classical sense. He wanted hands like cracked bark, faces like weathered wood. His models were not professionals, and sometimes they laughed at his intensity. But he paid them when he could, often with food, sometimes with flowers from the garden. He studied anatomy books. He copied prints. He wrote to Theo often, asking for supplies, for books, for guidance. Theo, ever the faithful brother, did what he could. He sent money when possible. He praised Vincent's early drawings, even when they were clumsy, and in every letter he offered what Vincent needed most: belief. For a short time there was calm. Vincent had a purpose again. His days had shape, drawing in the morning, walking at noon, writing letters at dusk. But still, something restless stirred beneath the surface. He tried to form attachments, sometimes awkwardly. He grew fond of a woman named Key Voss, a cousin by marriage. She was widowed and kind, and Vincent imagined a life with her, quiet, shared, full of mutual understanding. But when he confessed his feelings, she refused him, firmly, completely. He could not accept it. He sent letters. He walked miles to see her. Once, He even held his hand over a flame to prove his devotion. But she did not relent, nor did his family support the match. His father called it indecent. His mother wept. The pain deepened his resolve. He turned more fiercely to his drawing. He wanted, now more than ever, to make the kind of work that could not be ignored. That carried weight. That told the truth about life, its roughness, its quiet labor, its worn and lovely edges. The conflict with his family grew worse. His father suggested he find other work. Vincent refused. He moved out before Christmas and settled for a while in The Hague. There, he sought training from Anton Mauve, a distant relative and an accomplished painter. Mauve showed him watercolors, oils, how to mix colors, how to set a composition. But even this relationship frayed. Vincent had his own way of working, intense, impulsive, sometimes erratic. He resented instruction, even as he craved approval. Still, he worked. Every day, for hours, he drew beggars and shoemakers, seamstresses, men pushing carts. He painted a pair of worn boots and spent 3 days on the cracks alone. He made mistakes, tore pages, tried again. He was not yet a master of form, but the feeling in his work was beginning to sharpen. By the time he reached his early 30s, Vincent was no longer a boy in the fields. He had become something else. Not yet the artist he would one day be remembered as, but no longer a wanderer without cause. He had chosen a path, narrow, difficult, solitary, but his own. He still dreamed of love. He still clung to faith, though it had changed shape. But most of all, he dreamed of art, not as decoration, but as a calling, a way of seeing the world clearly and loving it in its tired, weather-beaten truth. In every line he drew, you could still hear the hush of Zundert, the sound of wind in tall grass, the silence of a churchyard, the feeling of a name carved twice. And so began his life, not as the Vincent who sold paintings or filled galleries, but the Vincent who watched, who walked, who drew, and who waited silently for the light to find him. Vincent wandered the narrow paths of the Borinage long after the church had turned him away. His dismissal did not come with anger. It came with disappointment, a quiet folding of hands, a letter too polite to say what it meant, that he was too much, or not enough. Still, he stayed. He rented a room in a miner's cottage. The walls were bare, the mattress thin, a single chair, a chipped basin, a window that looked out onto a yard of blackened earth. From the moment he rose until dusk, Vincent walked. He knew the miners by name. He helped carry water. He sat beside children with coughs and brought bread to women who had lost husbands to the tunnels. His own meals were sparse. His coat was patched and thin. He gave away what little he had, always convinced that others needed it more. His family, watching from afar, worried. They wrote with concern. Even Theo asked gently if this was the right path. But Vincent had quieted something restless in him. The world had never made more sense than it did among the poor. He saw them not as subjects of charity, but as mirrors of truth. Their lives were stripped of polish, their suffering without performance. And in their faces, in their bent shoulders and tired eyes, Vincent began to see something that no pulpit could teach. He saw holiness. It was there, in a woman mending a coat beneath a flickering lamp, in a child scraping coal dust from his fingernails, in a man hunched on the edge of his bed, boots still on, staring into the darkness. And so, quietly, he began to draw again. At first, just sketches, quick, humble impressions, a hand gripping a shovel, a face pressed against the crook of an arm, the folds of a blanket clinging to tired knees. He didn't show them to anyone. He didn't plan. He just recorded what he saw, not because it was beautiful, but because it was true. Theo noticed the change. The letters began to shift. Vincent spoke less of sermons and more of gestures, of how shadows fell across a man's spine, of the way a mother's fingers curved gently around a spoon. He wrote with urgency, as if afraid the feeling would slip away before he could explain it. "I feel," he wrote, "that my path lies in drawing, not as escape, but as witness." Art, to Vincent, was not decoration. It was not invention. It was reverence, a kind of prayer made with lines instead of words. And in this new devotion, he found a strange steadiness. For the first time in years, his thoughts gathered around a purpose. He left the Borinage in early spring, the hills still dark with soot, the trees just beginning to green. He carried with him a bundle of drawings, a few worn books, and a head full of faces that would never quite leave him. He returned to his parents' home once more, older now, a little thinner, but changed. This time, he did not come to please them. His parents welcomed him back with the quiet grace of people who had stopped expecting anything. Their home in Eton was tidy, its rhythms unchanged. Vincent entered it like a guest who had stayed away too long to explain. He brought little with him, no titles, no wages, just a sketchbook, and the scent of coal still in his coat. They asked about his work. He said little. They asked about the church. He said less. But in the corner of the sitting room, he began again. He set up a small table by the window, a box of pencils, a stack of rough paper. He worked from morning until the light faded. His mother brought him tea without speaking. His father watched him with cautious eyes. They were still hoping, perhaps, that this was temporary, that he might find steady work, that the fire in him might soften. But Vincent no longer looked for steadiness. He had lived among people who worked until their hands bled, who ate crusts and did not complain. He wanted to give those lives permanence. He wanted to show their beauty, not by polishing it, but by honoring its wear. He drew peasants mostly, women at spinning wheels, men bent over plows, children barefoot in the dirt. He was still teaching himself. The shapes weren't perfect, the lines unsure, but the feeling was there. A kind of hush around the figures, as if the world had stopped just long enough to see them, and always, he wrote to Theo. Their letters were long now, sometimes 5 or 6 pages, filled with questions and sketches and scraps of ideas. Vincent would describe his methods, his thoughts on light, on anatomy, on the faces of the poor. Theo, who was now working as an art dealer in Paris, replied with patience and faith. He sent books, supplies, encouragement. The brothers, though apart, grew closer through paper than many siblings ever do in person. One afternoon, Vincent came home with a woman named Cian. She was thin, tired-looking, with a face that had known cold mornings and hard floors. A former seamstress, a sex worker. She had a child and nowhere to go. Vincent took her in, not out of romance, but compassion. He saw in her the same quiet dignity he saw in the miners, the same ache. They lived together for a time, not happily, not easily, but honestly. He drew her constantly, sitting by the stove, feeding her child, lying on the floor, eyes closed, as if listening to the silence. These were not grand portraits. They were quiet records of survival, of presence, of being seen. But the arrangement scandalized his family. His father was furious. His mother wept. Vincent, unmoved, continued to draw. Eventually, the pressure grew too strong. He left Eton again, this time for good. He wandered for a time, to The Hague, to Drenthe, then back to Nieuwenan, where his father had taken a new parish post. There, he lived in a small room at the back of the house and began to paint more seriously. Earth tones, heavy outlines, rough faces. He was still looking for holiness, still trying to speak without a pulpit. And slowly, the world he had seen in the Borinage, The world of toil and silence, of small hopes and larger losses, began to find its voice in his hands. Nuenen was quiet, set among fields that changed with the season and cottages that seemed to lean into the wind. Vincent arrived in late autumn. The air smelled of burning wood, and the first frost clung to the hedges. His father welcomed him with a cautious embrace. His mother stood a few steps behind. He took up residence in the back of the parsonage, a small room with a window that faced east. Enough light in the morning to draw by. The walls were bare, save for the sketches he tacked up over time. Studies of hands, of faces, of work-worn shoes. He kept to himself, rising early, eating little, speaking less. His art had become his only voice. Each day, he ventured into the village or its surrounding fields, sketchbook under his arm, charcoal smudging his fingers. He drew weavers at their looms, farmers hunched over root crops, mothers knitting by oil lamp. These were not sentimental portraits. They were hard, truthful, tender. The kind of images that linger not because they impress, but because they feel remembered. He began to study the structure of things more seriously. Bones, muscles, gestures in motion. He taught himself through repetition. Over and over, he drew the same pose, adjusting it by degrees. He practiced hands for weeks, feet for months. He was not trying to please. He was trying to understand. And always, he wrote to Theo. The letters now read like a conversation unfolding across time. Vincent described the way light gathered in corners, how the texture of wool differed from linen, how the faces of the elderly carried stories deeper than any book. He asked for feedback, for paints, for money sometimes, always with apology. He knew how much Theo gave and how little he had in return. But he also knew this life was the only one that felt honest. Theo understood, or at least tried to. He believed in Vincent's work, even if the world did not. In Nuenen, Vincent was an outsider. The townspeople found him strange. He walked alone, avoided gatherings, and talked of art as though it were sacred. He paid peasants to sit for him, sometimes for hours, instructing them to stay as they were, hunched, tired, unfinished. He didn't want smiles. He didn't want poses. He wanted truth, even if it was difficult. Some neighbors gossiped. They called him eccentric, melancholic, obsessed. Others simply avoided him. His parents tried to intervene, but Vincent was beyond soft correction now. He knew what he saw in these people, even if no one else did. That winter, he painted in earnest. The cold bit at his fingers. The air inside the studio smelled of turpentine and smoke. He worked by daylight and candlelight both, painting not to finish, but to feel his way deeper into the work. He focused now on a single idea, that art should carry weight, not the weight of prestige or fame, but the weight of reality, that a woman peeling potatoes could be more beautiful than a cathedral if drawn with care. And with that belief, his drawings began to carry a new kind of silence, a silence shaped not by absence, but by presence. As winter gave way to spring, Vincent's sketches grew bolder. He began to paint more frequently. Though supplies were scarce and the colors he used were dark, browns, ochres, deep greens, he was not painting beauty in the usual sense. He was painting the world as it truly was, as it felt in his hands. He was preparing, though he may not have known it yet, for what would become his first great work. He returned again and again to a single family, peasants who lived on the edge of town, in a low house with sagging beams and an earth floor. He watched them in every season, in every light. They worked hard, spoke little, bore their days with a kind of quiet weight. He studied their faces until he could draw them from memory. The slope of a nose, the angle of a cheekbone, the wear on their knuckles. He painted them not once, but dozens of times. He worked in sketches first, then oil. He visited them at dusk, when the day's light hung low and golden. And then, in the late spring of 1885, he gathered all he had learned, every line, every shadow, every hunger, and painted the potato eaters. 5 figures huddled around a table, a small oil lamp above, a pot between them, hands reaching, faces worn, the skin gray with work, the expressions grave, honest, inward, no smiles, no drama, just supper. He wrote to Theo with pride, not boastful, but full of conviction. I wanted to show them eating the food they've earned by the sweat of their brow. I wanted to show that they've tilled the earth with those hands they put in the dish, and that it speaks of honest labor. Theo was supportive, though he hinted gently that others might not understand. And indeed, when the painting was shown in a few small circles, reactions were cold. The technique was too rough, the figures too coarse, the colors too dark. Critics dismissed it. Vincent was disappointed, but not surprised. He had known, even as he painted it, that the world preferred polish. But polish was not what he had to give. What he had were these lives, tired, uncelebrated, full of meaning. He believed they deserved to be seen. That summer, tragedy came. His father, Theodorus, suffered a sudden stroke and died. Vincent stood at his grave with his hat in his hands, unsure what to feel. Their relationship had been strained for years. There had been hope between them once, and then distance. Now, there was silence. Vincent did not cry, but something in him settled that day, as if a tether had quietly slipped. He left Noonan not long after. He traveled again, to Antwerp, to Brussels, searching for instruction, for influence, for peace. He studied anatomy more seriously. He looked to Japanese prints, to the bright brushstrokes of new painters. His world began to open, but he carried Noonan with him. He carried the shadows, the hands, the faces lit by a single lamp. He carried the truth he had learned in silence, that a pencil could be gospel if you held it the right way. By the time Vincent arrived in Antwerp, winter had begun its slow spread across the rooftops. The city moved with more haste than the villages he had known. There were shops, carriages, cafes with smoke curling from their chimneys, but Vincent paid little attention to the social rhythms. He rented a small attic room, cold and drafty, lit by a single window that faced a brick wall. He lived on bread and coffee, sometimes absinthe. He spent most of what Theo sent him on paints. The walls of the room soon disappeared beneath studies, pinned sketches, color tests, copies of prints he admired, Japanese woodblocks, Rembrandt etchings, the curved grace of Millet's peasants. Vincent enrolled briefly at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, hoping to refine his skills. But he clashed with instructors. The rules felt false to him. He wanted art to breathe, to speak, not to follow a method, but to tell the truth. His drawing grew stronger in Antwerp, more assured. He studied the human figure, not just in anatomy books, but in the flesh. He frequented life drawing sessions, where models stood for hours in shifting light. He was fascinated by shoulders, by knees, by the small dips of skin beneath collarbones, not for their beauty, but for their weight, their lividness. He sketched hands every day. He believed a person's whole story could be found in the way their fingers curled, or how they held a spoon, or brushed hair from their face. His own body began to fail him. His teeth ached. His stomach was often in knots. He fainted once while painting and came to alone, paintbrush still in his hand. Yet he would not stop. He believed, now more than ever, that he was beginning to find his voice. Not the polished eloquence of trained artists, but something rougher, truer. And through all of this, he wrote to Theo. The letters, now thick with reflections on color and form, also carried a quiet urgency. He felt time pressing in. He had lost much already: family, comfort, health. He could not afford to lose his work too. It was Theo who suggested Paris. The city was a center of the art world. The Impressionists were gaining attention. New galleries were opening. Painters were experimenting with light, with brushstroke, with emotion. And most important, Theo was there, working, connected, and willing to help. Vincent agreed. In early 1886, he packed his few belongings and boarded a train north. The countryside blurred past, brown trees against a gray sky, fields thawing under patches of snow. He sat by the window, sketchbook in hand, watching the world unfold like pages he had not yet read. He arrived at Theo's apartment on Rue Laval unannounced. Theo opened the door to find his older brother, pale and thin, with a bundle of canvases under his arm and shoes worn nearly to the sole. He let him in without a word. For the first time in years, the brothers lived under the same roof. The apartment was small, but it held warmth. Theo, tidy by nature, gave Vincent the larger room, knowing he'd need the light. Vincent filled it quickly. Canvases leaned against the walls, sketches piled on the desk, pencils, brushes, and scraps of cloth scattered across the floor like leaves after wind. He worked from morning to dusk, stepping out only for walks or visits to galleries. Paris was a new language to him, and he was listening closely. The light was different here, softer, more fractured. It slid through the windows in pale sheets, touched buildings with a golden shimmer. The colors of the city astonished him: pink rooftops, blue-gray streets after rain, skin that glowed in candlelight. He saw it all with the eyes of someone newly woken. For the first time, he met other painters. Theo introduced him to Toulouse-Lautrec, Pissarro, and Seurat. He saw their works, wild with color, loose with form, full of movement. At first, he resisted. Their paintings felt incomplete to him, too airy, too soft. But slowly, something in him gave way. He began experimenting with brighter tones, yellows, greens, oranges laid side by side with vibrating intensity. He studied Japanese prints, marveled at their simplicity, their composition, their honesty. He painted cafe scenes, still lifes, rooftops at dusk. His brushwork changed. He no longer blended. He pressed the paint into the canvas in small dashes, each stroke alive and individual. He painted dozens of self-portraits. In some, he stared straight ahead. In others, he looked away. The backgrounds changed: blues, greens, swirling lines. But his face remained the same: tired eyes, firm mouth, a man trying to hold still in a world that never stopped moving. And yet, even in this flurry of color, something in Vincent stayed rooted in the soil. He could admire the shimmering light of the city, but his heart still leaned toward the roughness of the earth, toward the weight of a boot, the curve of a back, the quiet in a woman's face after work. He missed the countryside, the smell of fields, the silence after supper. That tension between brightness and burden shaped his work in Paris. He was learning to hold both, to paint the light without losing the shadow. But the city wore him down. The noise, the pace, the constant movement. He grew thin. His moods shifted rapidly. He quarreled with fellow artists. Even with Theo, whose patience ran deep, the strain showed. Vincent knew he could not stay. He dreamed of the South. He wrote of lemon trees and blue skies, of sun that flooded the earth with gold, of building a studio where artists could live and work together, share meals, share silence, paint the truth without judgment. In early 1888, he boarded a train to Arles, a town bathed in sunlight near the mouth of the Rhone. He carried with him his paints, his brushes, a handful of books, and the hope that maybe, finally, he would find the stillness he had always sought. Paris in the mid-1880s was a city caught between two heartbeats. One still echoed with the heavy tread of the old salons, academic painting, perfection, rules. The other pulsed with something lighter, looser, brighter. A generation of young painters had begun to chase light itself across canvas, no longer interested in history or myth, but in the shifting rhythms of the everyday. Vincent entered this world like a man stepping from shadow into sudden sun. When he moved into Theo's apartment on Rue Laval in early 1886, he brought with him a palette of browns and grays. The earth still clung to his boots, still clung to his brush. He painted people who worked with their hands, who bore the marks of hard life. He was uncertain how to fit among these new painters. Parisians with fine scarves, soft pastels, and eyes trained on light. But Vincent did what he had always done. He watched. At first he copied the masters. He spent days in the Louvre, sketching the delicate grace of Japanese prints and the solemn power of Rembrandt's self-portraits. Then he visited exhibitions of the Impressionists. He studied their brushstrokes, noted how they placed two colors side by side to make the third appear in the eye. He listened to debates in cafes. He lingered outside galleries, letting the images speak before stepping inside. Slowly, his palette began to shift. He traded the old earth tones for cobalt blue and chrome yellow. He began to see how color was not simply description. It was feeling. He painted the interior of his room in short, sharp strokes. The walls blue, the bed orange, the floor a restless sea of greens and reds. He painted flowers that reached too far, faces with eyes like whirlpools. Even his own reflection became an experiment. The beard red, the background pulsing with lines like heat. And in this storm of color, something quiet began to rise. He was no longer trying to capture what the world looked like. He was trying to show how it felt. Vincent's days in Paris followed no schedule. He rose late, often after Theo had already left for the gallery. He worked through the afternoon into the dusk, sometimes through the night. The apartment filled with the scent of oil paint and turpentine. The walls slowly vanished beneath drying canvases. Flowers, rooftops, his own face, again and again. He experimented not only with color, but with feeling. A chair became a symbol of loneliness. A pair of shoes hinted at miles walked through fields and cities. He painted a cafe at night, its yellow lights burning like halos over empty tables. Even the stars, when he finally began to look upward, seemed to spin with something deeper than astronomy. But for all this growth, Paris wore on him. The city never slept. The streets were loud, the cafes crowded. And though Vincent met other painters, Lautrec, Bernard, Signac, he found it hard to belong. He was intense, often moody, his thoughts rushing ahead of his words. Some admired his passion, others avoided it. Theo watched his brother with a mix of awe and worry. Vincent was working faster than ever, but his health was faltering. He ate little, drank too much, slept irregularly. He spoke of visions, of sounds in the night, of needing to go somewhere simpler, somewhere brighter. The South, he said, would be his salvation. He imagined a place flooded with sunlight, where the sky met the fields like a soft breath. He spoke of yellow, not pale, not quiet, but the yellow of wheat and sunflowers, of butter and brass. A yellow so alive it might make a man whole again. He dreamed of building a community there, a studio shared by artists who worked not in competition, but in harmony. He would call it the Studio of the South, a place of light, of truth, of shared vision. Voice insert 3. I dream of painting, and then I paint my dream. Vincent Theo, ever supportive, helped fund the trip. He believed, or wanted to believe, that Vincent might find peace in Arles. And so, in February of 1888, Vincent packed his paints, his brushes, and his notebooks. He boarded the train with no map, no certainty, only a vision of sun and color. As the train moved south, the world around him changed. The sky opened, the land turned golden, the trees lost their wet gray bark and stretched out toward the warmth. He stepped off in Arles and felt the light on his skin like a kind of forgiveness. Arles was smaller, quieter, the kind of town where the sky felt close and the streets emptied at night. Vincent took a room at the hotel restaurant Carrel while he searched for a studio. He wandered the town alone at first, studying the pale stone walls, the trees with their twisted branches, the way light slid across the rooftops like melted silver in the morning. He painted almost immediately. The southern sun did something to his colors. They sharpened. They rang out. Blues turned electric. Yellows burned. He painted orchards in bloom, rows of poplars, the riverbank where laundry flapped like wings. The pace of his work quickened. He sometimes finished a canvas in a single sitting, his brush moving fast, as if trying to keep up with something flickering just out of reach. Then he found the yellow house. It sat on Place Lamartine, a corner building with shutters and just enough room for dreams. He rented it with help from Theo, furnished it modestly, and began to paint the space as if preparing a chapel. The walls, the chairs, even the bed became subjects for the canvas. It was more than a home. It was a hope. He wrote to Gauguin, inviting him to join. The studio of the South could begin, Vincent said. Two painters side by side, talking, working, challenging each other in good faith. Gauguin hesitated but agreed. Vincent prepared the house with care. He painted a set of sunflowers to brighten the guest room. He bought extra brushes. He imagined dinners full of conversation, shared canvases, silence between friends. He dreamed of belonging. Gauguin arrived in October. At first, things went well. They painted. They talked late into the night. They walked the streets, studied the sea. Gauguin more structured, more worldly. Vincent more emotional, more instinctive. But soon, their differences deepened. Vincent needed connection. Gauguin needed space. Vincent wanted harmony. Gauguin brought critique. The tension built quietly, then quickly. One evening in December, after days of rising tempers and strained words, something broke. Vincent's mind, already fragile, gave way. He walked the cold streets alone. He returned home and cut his ear. Then he wrapped it carefully, placed it in an envelope, and brought it to a woman he knew at a nearby brothel. No one knows exactly why. The town was horrified. Gauguin left the next day. The dream of the studio of the South collapsed without a sound. Vincent was found the following morning, unconscious in his bed. Blood dried on his face. Canvases still wet, leaning against the wall. The yellow of the sunflowers watching in silence. He was taken to the hospital, and for a while, all he saw was white. Sheets, walls, the blank ceiling above a bed he did not recognize. But he lived. And when he opened his eyes, the world, broken and blurred, still shimmered with color. The hospital in Arles sat at the edge of town, its courtyard shaded by plane trees that swayed with the mistral wind. Vincent lay in a narrow bed, his head bandaged, his thoughts like a river broken into eddies. He did not remember everything. He remembered the silence after Gauguin left, the sharpness of the razor, the cold floor, the light from the window that did not move. The doctors called it madness. Others whispered it was sorrow. But to Vincent, it felt like drowning. Not in darkness, but in too much light. Theo arrived within days. He sat by the bed and held his brother's hand. He spoke softly, told him that everything would be all right, that he would not be left alone, that he was still a painter, still loved, still himself. Vincent listened with closed eyes. Then he nodded once. The yellow house remained, but it was no longer home. The townspeople avoided him now. Children stared. Letters arrived less often. The dream of an artist's collective had ended. But the urge to paint had not. Within weeks, he was asking for canvas. The nurses brought him brushes and oils. He set up a small easel in the hospital garden and began again. Slowly at first. A hallway, a nurse's shawl, the blue shutters half open in morning light. His lines were tighter, but the colors remained bright, as if he were using paint to tether himself to the world. He painted the ward, the courtyard, the faces of other patients. He found rhythm again, not in conversation, but in brushstroke. The act of painting calmed him, steadied the noise. It gave him a way back to himself. When he was well enough, he returned briefly to the yellow house. But the silence there was different now. Not peaceful, but hollow. He walked its rooms and felt the echo of a friendship that had never had time to soften. The sunflower paintings still hung on the wall. He stared at them for a long time. Then he packed a small case and left. He would not live there again. He checked himself into the asylum at Saint-Rémy de Provence, a place of quiet hills and walled gardens, where the days passed in bells and the nights in sighs. Vincent arrived not as a patient defeated, but as a man who still believed in work, in beauty, in the worth of trying. The asylum at Saint-Rémy was housed in an old monastery. Its stone walls were thick, its windows barred. Cypress trees lined the gravel paths like silent sentinels. Vincent was given a small room with whitewashed walls and a narrow bed. From the window, he could see a slope of hills and the tops of olive trees that swayed gently, even when the air was still. His days settled into a rhythm. He rose early, took his meals in silence, painted in the garden or within the walled confines of the hospital grounds. Sometimes he was allowed to walk beyond them, always with an escort. Other days, he could barely rise from bed. His illness came in waves. There were weeks when he painted furiously, canvas after canvas, each filled with urgent lines and skies that moved like water. Then came the quiet spells, the ones full of trembling, confusion, and long stretches where words slipped away like mist. But when he was steady, he worked. He painted the view from his window dozens of times, the curve of the path, the sweep of the trees, the hills darkening at dusk. He painted the garden, the cypresses, the fields beyond the wall. He painted irises, their blue petals twisting like wind-blown fabric. He painted olive groves, their trunks gnarled like old hands. And one night, when sleep would not come, he painted the sky. He had no canvas prepared, so he used an older one turned on its side. He looked out from memory, not the real view, but the one that lived behind his eyes. The stars were not quiet. They pulsed. They circled. They burned. He gave them halos. He let the sky move like a river. He placed the moon too close, the cypress too tall, the village too small, and yet it all felt true. He called it Starry Night. He sent it to Theo with no great fanfare, just another painting among many. But even then, something in its whirling silence stood apart, as if, in that single canvas, Vincent had found a way to say all the things that words could not hold. Why, I ask myself, shouldn't the shining dots of the sky be as accessible as the black dots on the map of France? Vincent Theo responded with kindness, though sales remained rare. The world still wasn't ready. Or perhaps it was just looking in another direction. But Vincent painted anyway. He painted with urgency, with need, with devotion. He painted even when his hands shook, even when he doubted his own mind. He painted to remember that he was still here. And slowly, Saint-Rémy, with its heavy walls and narrow halls, became a sanctuary of sorts. Not for healing, but for creation. A place where his ghosts could settle, if only for a little while. Spring in Saint-Rémy came slowly. The mistral winds softened. The trees began to bud. The earth warmed just enough to coax flowers from its surface. Vincent, still living within the asylum's quiet routines, found color returning not only to the garden but to his palette. He painted flowering almond branches against a sky so pale it was almost white. He painted pink-blossomed trees along stone fences. He painted fields split by paths, each stroke deliberate, unhurried. There was a gentleness in these works, not less passion, but more stillness, a kind of peace blooming alongside the chaos. Still, the episodes came. There were days when he collapsed without warning, when his hands trembled too much to hold a brush, when confusion overtook him and he could not speak. At times, he feared he was becoming a stranger to himself, but painting remained his tether. As soon as he could rise, he painted. If he could see, he painted. If he could hold breath long enough to feel light, he painted. Theo continued to write. The letters were softer now, full of hope and news. He had married, and his wife Jo had given birth to a son. They named the child Vincent in honor of his brother. When Vincent received the letter, he sat for a long while without moving. Then he took a clean canvas and began painting almond blossoms again. This time with more care, more tenderness. A gift for the child whose name now echoed his own. Outside the asylum walls, the art world began to turn its head. Theo submitted some of Vincent's paintings to exhibitions. A few found their way into small galleries. Critics noticed the colors, the brushwork, the intensity. There were murmurs of promise, of originality. A few sales followed, not many, but enough to light a small flame. Vincent noticed. He was grateful, but he had stopped hoping for fame. What he wanted now was clarity. What he needed was quiet. In May of 1890, after a year in Saint-Rémy, he left the asylum. Not in despair, but with resolve. He was not cured. He never pretended to be. But he had painted through the storm. And now, perhaps, there was another place waiting for him. Somewhere he could paint not as a patient, but simply as a man. He chose a village called Auvers-sur-Oise, north of Paris, surrounded by wheat fields and sky, a place to begin again. The journey to Saint-Rémy de Provence had not been planned in a moment of clarity. Vincent arrived in May 1889, just months after the collapse in Arles. He admitted himself voluntarily, carrying with him a small trunk, a few canvases, and a heart worn thin by longing. He did not come to be healed, not entirely. He came for stillness. The asylum was housed in a former monastery, the Monastère Saint-Paul de Mausolée. Its thick walls held a kind of sacred hush. Olive trees circled the garden. Beyond them stretched fields stitched with rows of grain, broken now and then by low stone walls or the shape of a cypress rising like a flame. His room was small, bare floor, white walls, an iron-framed bed, a narrow window looking out over the hills. Yet it was more than enough. Here, time slowed. There were no carriages, no cafes, no swirl of conversation. There were only the rhythms of bells and the rustle of wind through trees. Days passed in routine. Meals served quietly, walks in the garden, the murmur of prayers from down the corridor. Vincent began to draw again within days of arriving. At first, he copied Millet, Delacroix, Japanese prints. This calmed his mind. Repetition, familiarity. Then he began to step outside with brushes in hand. His first paintings at Saint-Rémy were of the garden, the beds of wild irises, the curving branches of trees that bent over gravel paths. He worked quickly, sometimes finishing 2 or 3 pieces in a day. The nurses watched him with a kind of reverent awe. He moved like someone whose breath was paint. And though the quiet helped, the episodes still came. Without warning, he would descend into darkness. Days of confusion, silence, despair. He heard voices. He forgot where he was. Once, he tried to eat his own paint. The nurses removed the oils from his room after that, returning them only when he had steadied. But always, after the worst passed, he painted. His brush seemed to hold what words could not. The the pain, the gratitude, the quiet ache of being. His colors grew bolder, his skies more alive, and the trees, those trees, began to twist and bend on his canvas, no longer still but reaching, writhing, lifting themselves toward something unseen. This was not realism. This was revelation. By late summer, the asylum grounds had become Vincent's whole world. He painted the view from his room more than a dozen times, each with small changes. The shape of a cloud, the slant of the hills, the quiet force of a tree's silhouette. To others, the landscape might have seemed still, but to Vincent, it was always in motion. He saw the wind in the grass, the weight of heat in the sky, the hush before dusk. He rarely spoke of loneliness, though it clung to him like a second shadow. His letters to Theo were full of gratitude, concern, and flashes of joy. He wrote of paint like a man writing of breath. Describing a single tree, he once said, "It seems to me as if it speaks." He painted olive trees by the dozen. Cypress trees, too, their tall black spires curving like smoke into sky. These were not symbolic choices. He saw in them something that mirrored himself. Resilience, restlessness, the strange beauty of being both rooted and reaching. His health remained fragile. The attacks would return without warning. Sometimes they lasted days, sometimes weeks. In those moments, even light became too sharp. He could not speak, could not paint. He would lie in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the storm inside him to pass. And still, when he could, he worked. He painted portraits of fellow patients. He painted the corridor of the asylum, the trees beyond the wall, a field of wheat swept by wind. Even his darkest moments found their way into paint. One night, he began a piece with swirling stars and a crescent moon hanging above a sleeping village. The brush moved like wind itself, curling the sky into waves of blue and gold. Starry night, he called it. Just a glimpse from his room, filtered through the ache and awe of his mind. The painting was not meant to impress. It was meant to survive. And then, slowly, something shifted. The staff noticed it first. A calmness between spells. A deeper stillness in his hands. Vincent began to speak more softly. He took longer walks. He painted with less haste, more purpose. Not because the storm had passed, but because he had learned, in some quiet way, how to walk through it without fear. Theo continued to support him. In letters, in money, in faith. And Vincent held on to that like a lifeline. The world might never understand his work, but his brother did. And sometimes, that was enough. As the months passed, Vincent began to paint not only what he saw, but what he remembered. Fields he had walked as a child, churches under wide skies, workers planting seeds in early spring. He painted from memory, but also from feeling, a kind of quiet praise for the life that continued, even as his own felt uncertain. His brush moved with new intention. He no longer chased perfection. He chased truth. The truth of a crooked tree, the truth of a cloud shaped by wind, the truth of his own tired hands holding a brush for the 1,000th time. There was a new tenderness in his colors. He painted almond blossoms for Theo's newborn son, also named Vincent. Pale flowers against a blue sky, full of hope and fragility. He painted irises, yellow fields, sunlit gardens. Even the cypresses, tall and dark, no longer felt ominous. They looked almost protective. Still, he knew he could not stay at Saint-Rémy forever. The walls had kept him safe. The routine had helped him mend. But Vincent had always needed the world, not the noise of cities, but the open air, the long walks, the fields where wheat bent in the wind and clouds moved like questions across the sky. He wanted to work, to live somewhere quieter than Paris, but freer than a hospital. And so Theo found a solution. North of the city, in the village of Auvers-sur-Oise, lived a doctor named Paul Gachet. He was both a physician and an amateur painter, sympathetic to artists, understanding of Vincent's needs. The plan was simple. Vincent would live in the village, work outdoors, and be visited regularly by the doctor. It was a gentle hope. Vincent accepted. He packed his few belongings. He folded his letters, his sketches, his well-worn brushes. Before leaving, he stood for a long while beneath the cypress trees in the garden. The wind moved gently through the leaves. The sky was pale and bright. He touched the bark of one tree, as if to say, "Thank you." And then he walked through the gate, into the wide world again. Not fully healed, but still painting. The village of Auvers-sur-Oise was a small patch of stillness just beyond the breath of Paris. It lay in the folds of green hills and golden fields, where paths curved gently between stone walls and the river flowed without urgency. Vincent arrived in May of 1890 with his canvas bag, his paints, and the weight of years behind his eyes. He lodged at the Auberge Ravou, a narrow-roofed inn with a quiet staircase and a room just beneath the attic. It was small, scarcely more than a bed and a window, but the light there was kind. He hung a few of his sketches along the wall, set his brushes on a shelf, and went out walking. The fields were his first companions. He walked for hours, past wheat swaying in warm wind, past cottages with flowering gardens, past a church whose steeple rose like a watchful finger toward the sky. He took in the trees, the curves of hedgerows, the sky full of summer clouds, and then he painted. He painted with speed, with hunger. Some days he finished a canvas before dusk. Others he worked from memory late into the evening, the walls of his room, lit by the low flicker of lamplight. There was no hesitation now. His brush moved with purpose, unshaken even when his mind trembled. The doctor, Paul Gachet, visited him often. Gachet was odd in his own way, full of ideas, full of theories, but kind. He believed that painting was not merely a symptom of Vincent's condition, but a form of medicine itself. He encouraged the long walks, the use of color, the honesty in Vincent's work. Still, he worried. He saw how thin Vincent had grown, how often his voice slipped into sadness. Vincent, in turn, painted the doctor's portrait. It was not flattering. Gachet's face looked tired, his expression folded with melancholy. But it was tender, it was true. Vincent called it the expression of our times, weary and yet still hoping. Theo came to visit in June. He brought news from Paris, letters from Joe, a recent sale. One of Vincent's paintings had been shown in an exhibition and had drawn quiet praise. Theo said others were beginning to notice. Slowly, uncertainly, Vincent smiled, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He thanked his brother, held his hand, and said nothing more. Because he knew. Praise was not what he had been painting for. July came with heat and thunderclouds that never quite broke. The wheat fields around Auvers ripened under a pale sun, their gold deepening with every passing day. Vincent rose early, walked out with his easel strapped to his back, and chose places no one else seemed to notice. A half-cut slope, a tangle of wild grass, the edge of a field where crows gathered in uneasy flocks. He painted with urgency now, wheat fields under restless sky. The roofs of Auvers clustered tight as if for shelter. A gnarled tree that stood alone by the riverbank, its limbs reaching, always reaching. His strokes were thick, layered. The colors sang, even when the scene was full of storm. He painted as if each canvas might be his last. To Theo, he wrote often, but the letters had changed. They were shorter, softer. His words no longer rushed or spilled. There was still gratitude, always gratitude, but also a stillness, as if something in him had quieted or settled. He wrote, "I feel a failure. That's it as far as I'm concerned. But that doesn't stop me from working." The world was beginning to listen, but Vincent had begun to stop waiting for it. He painted a final portrait of Dr. Gachet. He painted flowers in a vase, pink and white against blue. He painted the town's church from memory, giving it a strange tilt, its shadows almost violet. Even its windows looked like eyes, watching without blinking. And then, one afternoon, he walked into the Wheatfields again. No one saw him leave the inn. No one followed. He took his easel, his paints, but instead of setting up, he kept walking. He stopped somewhere between the edge of the village and the horizon, in a stretch of gold where the crows often rose in dark waves. He carried a revolver. A quiet crack sounded through the heat. No one turned. Vincent stumbled back through the fields, hands pressed to his side. He made it to the inn, climbed the stairs, lay down in his small room beneath the eaves, the light dimming through the shuttered window. He did not cry out. He did not leave a note. Just silence. The bullet had lodged deep, missing his heart, but wounding him beyond repair. A local doctor was called, but there was little to be done. Vincent lay quietly in his bed, pale, breathing shallowly. The room was dim, the walls lined with sketches that still clung to life even as his own slipped gently away. Word reached Theo within hours. He arrived by train, rushed up the narrow staircase, and sat beside his brother without speaking at first. Vincent opened his eyes. They were tired, but calm. Theo took his hand and held it tightly. For nearly 2 days, he did not leave his side. They spoke little. There was no need for apology, no need for explanation. There was only the soft rhythm of breath, the quiet creak of floorboards, and the deep hum of two lives that had always carried each other. "Do you want me to take you home?" Theo asked once. Vincent shook his head slowly. "No, the sadness will last." Those were among the last words he spoke. On the morning of July 29, 1890, Vincent passed away. The sun had barely risen. The town was still. The wheat fields outside glowed softly in the light, full and golden, heavy with seed. Theo arranged the funeral. They placed Vincent in a simple coffin. Yellow flowers, sunflowers, freshly cut, were laid beside him. A few friends came, painters, locals, the doctor. They stood in quiet reverence as the wind moved gently through the trees. There was no grandeur, no applause, just the earth, the light, the hush. Vincent was buried in the cemetery on the edge of Over, beneath a small stone. For a long time, there was no epitaph, but the silence spoke enough. Theo returned to Paris soon after, devastated. His own health had been faltering for months. Grief overcame him. Within 6 months, he too fell ill. In January of 1891, he died in a hospital in Utrecht, far from his wife and son, far from the gallery walls he had once filled with his brother's hopes. He was just 33. Jo van Gogh Bonger, Theo's widow, gathered their letters and Vincent's paintings. She brought them back into the light. She held them with care, gave them to the world one by one. Slowly, Vincent's name began to bloom. A name once carved into a stone alone, now whispered in galleries, painted on posters, spoken in awe. And years later, she made sure Theo was buried beside his brother. 2 graves, 2 names, the same silence between them. For many years, after Vincent's death, the world remained mostly silent about his work. A few small shows, a few quiet admirers. Nothing like the recognition that would later come. But in the attic of a modest Dutch home, Jo van Gogh Bonger began her quiet task. She had been Theo's wife, Vincent's sister-in-law, and now the keeper of a legacy too large to name. In a box of letters tied with string, she found hundreds of pages. Vincent's voice, clear and aching, written to Theo over decades. Descriptions of paintings, of fields, of pain, of hope. Words that shimmered with the same honesty as his brushstrokes. She read them slowly, her son sleeping in the next room. the sound of turning pages soft as breath. She began to gather the paintings. She cataloged them. She reached out to critics. She translated the letters, curated exhibitions, placed paintings in salons, galleries, homes. She became Vincent's voice in a world that had only half listened while he was alive. And she did not stop. Not even when galleries doubted, or collectors declined, or reviewers dismissed him. She knew. In her eyes, Vincent had always been a great painter, not because of fame, but because of feeling. And slowly, others began to see it too. By the early 1900s, his works began to draw attention. People spoke of the colors, the brushstrokes, the movement, but more than anything, they spoke of the heart. The raw, unguarded soul poured onto canvas in every leaf, every sky, every haunted pair of eyes. Critics called him revolutionary. Painters called him honest. Viewers, silent in galleries, standing before a self-portrait or the shimmer of starry night, simply wept. What am I in the eyes of most people? A non-entity, but I want to show by my work what a poor man has in his heart. Vincent. The legacies grew, but not in a rush. Like one of Vincent's fields, it rose slowly, season by season, letter by letter, canvas by canvas. And through it all, the bond between two brothers remained at the center, one who painted, one who believed, and one woman who carried both of their hopes forward through the silence. As the 20th century moved forward, Vincent's work moved with it, out of dusty attics and quiet auctions, into galleries and homes, into textbooks, and the hearts of those who had never held a paintbrush. Exhibitions were mounted in Amsterdam, Paris, Berlin. More people stood before the potato eaters and saw the reverence in its darkness. More paused at sunflowers and felt the light pressing outward. More looked up at starry night and saw their own thoughts turning in the sky. And still, Jo kept working. She published the letters, first in Dutch, then in translation. Each one a window into Vincent's world, into the careful tremble of his thought, the ache of his love for nature, and the unbreakable thread that ran between him and Theo. In those letters, the myth of the tortured genius softened into something more human. A man not simply mad or brilliant, but kind, tired, reverent, someone who loved wildflowers and long walks, someone who painted shoes with as much care as skies. In Amsterdam, a museum was envisioned. Jo's son, grown now, took up the work. He helped create a place where Vincent's paintings could live together, not scattered across continents, but breathing in shared space. The Van Gogh Museum opened in 1973, quiet walls, tall windows. Visitors still arrive daily. Some speak, some cry. Many say nothing at all. They stand in front of Vincent's paintings and feel the hush he painted into each one. No longer a failed artist, no longer a forgotten name, but a voice that never stopped speaking. If you hear a voice within you say, "You cannot paint," then by all means paint, and that voice will be silenced. Vincent. Beyond the museum walls, his work lives on in ways he never could have imagined. A sunflower bends on a postcard in a kitchen in Seoul. A copy of Starry Night glows on a bedroom wall in Sao Paulo. Children dip brushes into thick paint, trying to match the curl of a cypress, the spin of a star, the hush of a face lit by lamplight. Each one echoing a man who once walked through fields alone, unsure if anyone would ever see what he saw. And what remains now, more than a century after his death? Not only the paintings. Though they hang in museums and galleries, guarded, lit, studied, the greater part of Vincent's gift was never in oil or pigment. It was in the quiet way he saw the world, in the courage it took to keep painting through sorrow, to keep walking through the fields when the path vanished, to keep writing when no reply had come. His greatness was not in being different, but in being deeply human. He knew loneliness, and he gave it color. He knew pain, and he let it live on canvas without disguise. He knew beauty, and he refused to steal it from the places the world called plain. A vase, a chair, a tired man's hands. The sadness did last. He was right about that. But so did the light. Long after the fields fell silent, long after the letters stopped, long after the brushes were cleaned and packed away, the paintings continued to speak. Not loudly, but clearly. They remind us that even when no one is listening, the act of expression still matters. That to try, fully, honestly, tenderly, is itself a kind of triumph. I feel that there is nothing more truly artistic than to love people. Vincent. And so we remember him, not just as a master of color, not just as a name beneath glass, but as a man who painted through grief, who looked at tired hands and saw something holy, who watched the sky and made it sing, who felt too much and still gave more. A man who once wrote to his brother, "We cannot speak other than by our paintings," and who even now is still speaking.